Welcome to week 10, and this week will be particularly useful for those of you who want to do the purely theoretical question, which is looking at different generations of conflict resolution and different ways to look at it. So if you're doing this type of question, for example, you might take a look at where the conflict resolution studies came from, the fact that after the 90s and the end of the Cold War, civil wars and a whole range of conflict issues erupted that were probably more contained in a bipolar America versus Russia aligned world. And so how this led to conflict resolution, but also critiques of it, people who weren't so happy about the introduction of conflict resolution. It crosses over a lot of different disciplines, but also it is very connected with international relations theory. So it's no wonder that a lot of critiques come from this type of stream as well. So for those who've done, for example, international security studies, a few of the critiques that we look at this week will be familiar to you. Now, not only people who are doing in assignment number three the more theoretical, where does conflict resolution come from, how did it evolve question, but also you could use critiques to sound more sophisticated in terms of your assignment. So, for example, we're looking at 4 critiques this week: a realist critique, a critical theory critique, a post-structuralist critique, and a non-Western critique. So with these 4 critiques, it's using essentially a theory to debate a theory or an approach, if you call conflict resolution an approach. So that would be definitely more sophisticated when you come into the criteria of how you incorporate theory and you argue something. So, for example, a realist critique would say that to try and fiddle the world system with all of this conflict resolution is fraught with issues and dangers, because the reason why the world aligns as it does and states pursue their own self-interest and form alliances is to keep a certain type of order in the worldly system. And also, for example, a way you could use a realist critique is, say you were looking at a question on intervention and third-party interventions, like in Rwanda or Bosnia, wherever it might be. You could actually look at a realist critique and say, well, according to a realist critique, third-party interventions would only invite a whole lot of unholy alliances anyway, or agendas. Countries all have their own agendas. So you might even argue that no one can really altruistically intervene in another person's conflict. So that could be, for example, the way that you might use a realist critique. Then when we look at critical theory, just moving over, I was just having a look at the screen. When we're looking at critical theory approaches, then we're also looking at underlying causes of conflict and saying that conflict resolution approaches, a lot of them don't really get at things like failed states or why certain types of problems exist. So they don't do enough to address the underlying causes. So critical theory is actually coming up with problems, and not only problems but also solutions to problems. So a critical theory approach would address conflict resolution that way and say that while it can be useful to explain some things that happen in the world, it really falls short of usefulness in terms of being able to inform policy. You could even tie this in, for example, to arguments around peace building or long-term conflict transformation. You could say, for example, while conflict transformation or peace building is a goal, certainly, of using resolution and resolution tools, conflict resolution studies as a whole, you might find it's relatively silent on how this is actually achieved. In fact, a lot of what we were looking at this week suggests that a lot of conflict transformation happens actually at the grassroots within communities. So does conflict resolution appropriately address that? So in the case study you're looking at, you could consider it. So how would you say, to be sophisticated and get those high marks, I'm using a critical theory critique. So you could be talking about peace transformation in, say, Rwanda, and you could sort of note what's happened there. And you could say, however, a lot of the conflict resolution studies haven't explained how or why these transformations occur, or why there are certain barriers. So you could actually specifically say, using critical theory critique or critical theorist, and then actually name one of the scholars, says that, and then consider whether that's true and that applies to your case. So these are ways that you can use critiques. Post-structuralist critique says things like, the whole idea of conflict and peace is actually a debated concept, that we only understand what peace means because we understand what conflict means, or what peace means to one society and what conflict means to one society might be different to another person. Our idea in Australia of law and order is one thing. We might be quite horrified and call another country or developing nation, we might think they're completely unsophisticated or have a really tribal sense of justice. We might think that's terrible, but perhaps they have developed or moved into higher levels of law and order for what they came from. So this is the idea that meaning is in the eyes of the beholder, and we only understand our reality in comparison to the not, to what, we know what is by what's not. We know peace if we know conflict, for example. So it's saying that these ideas, that there are these fixed ideas that we bring into play with conflict resolution studies, don't work in a lot of contexts, and it should be more context specific. This is all in the modules, by the way, so if you want to pick up on any of these critiques, what you do is you have a look in week 10.2, you think, yeah, I like that, I might use that and go more into that, and then you have a look at your readings. And so the fourth area is non-Western critiques. That's a little bit related to what I said in post-structuralist critiques, in the sense that it's saying conflict resolution studies really emerged out of what's called the English School or the International Society approach, and it's a Western approach, so it doesn't suit developing country realities as much as it might Western countries, for example. Also, it's saying that you can bring in other ideas such as gender ideas or geographically specific ideas, more nuanced approaches to conflict resolution. So again, you can go into any four of those, and certainly if you're doing the question on how conflict resolution developed as a discipline, I would definitely have a look at including some of those critiques and some of those ideas, but also you can include them for almost any question in the essay. If you want to test it out, put it in a plan and come and talk to me, feel free to do that as well. So all the best, everyone. If you want to float any ideas, please practice your critiques this week in looking at the issues and the topics for week 10, or for practicing your ideas for assignment number 3. And don't forget, on Thursday night we have the Collaborate session for A3. If you can't make it, I highly recommend you listen to the recording. All right, have a good week.